Hey guys, it's Jane. I'm here today to talk to you about a book called Phoebe by Paula. This is a relatively new release. I think it was released in May. A friend recommended it to me and I read it and I thought I would come and tell you about it. It's a bit unlike things that I often talk about. In fact, it's an unusual kind of a book. I haven't read very much like this before, and although it wasn't earth-shattering, I found it interesting, and so it's unusual. I found it interesting. I thought I'd tell you about it. So, this is not a novel. Paula goes to some length to explain that she's not writing a novel. She hasn't set out to write a novel. But it's not strictly nonfiction either. There's lots and lots of scholarship behind the story that she's writing. In fact, the last quarter of the book is essentially footnotes, where she talks about the reason why she made certain decisions and suggests further reading for anybody who's interested. Full disclosure, I didn't read the entirety of the notes section. So the first 2/3 or 3/4 of the book is this story, but it's not really truly a novel. It is, in her words, an imaginative recreation of an historical event. She's trying to imagine herself into a situation, and although there are a few things that she makes up from whole cloth in order to make the story work, it's all based on what is known from history about the particulars of this situation. So, what is the situation that the story is based off of? The story of Phoebe is written about the arrival and the original reception of the book of Romans from the New Testament. The book of Romans is an epistle, i.e. a letter, written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Rome to kind of introduce himself, and it's written in expectation that the apostle will be following not long after the letter. So Paul had never been to Rome. The last chapter is a whole bunch of greetings, and a lot of the people who are characters in the story, their names are listed in the final chapter of Romans. So he obviously had some connections with the people in Rome, but he'd never actually been there before the letter was written. Phoebe, the title character and the main character in the story, in Paula's imagining, is the person who has actually travelled carrying the letter. So she's the deliverer of the letter. And there are reasons to suppose, Phoebe is mentioned by name in chapter 16 of Romans, and there are reasons, like from context, to argue that that is what happened, that she is the person who brought the letter. Although it does not say that explicitly in Romans, there is good reason to think that that may be the case. And so that's the starting point for the story. We follow Phoebe, a person from Romans 16 who we know not terribly much about, although Paula goes to great lengths to explain why she's extrapolated the things about this character from the 1 or 2 sentences from the Bible that we have. And then we have her coming to Rome with the letter from Paul. And then we have a couple of years while she's kind of waiting for Paul to arrive, and she has different dramas in her own life and in the life of the church. And then Paul, it turns out, has been arrested, and then he gets brought to Rome under arrest because he has appealed to Caesar, basically, and is waiting on a court case. Now, for those of you who have some familiarity with the events of the Acts of the Apostles and from the New Testament, you know that the end of the book of Acts, Paul is in Rome awaiting trial, and that is essentially where this story finishes. So the events of this book are all taken up in the last few years worth of the book of the Acts of Apostles, and it is an imaginative retelling of what life in the church was at that time, especially the church in Rome, like the big, big city at the center of the world at that time. Now, there were moments when the storytelling kind of actually elevated itself to almost be like something that you would read for pleasure. And I genuinely mean that, and I know that sounds like damning with faint praise, but as she hadn't actually set out to write a novel, I'm saying that there were parts of this book that actually kind of engrossed me so much that I wanted to know what was going on. Like, I really felt engaged with the characters. That was kind of the exception rather than the rule. A lot of it feels a bit like people who are sock puppet characters. Every time somebody's having a conversation, there's so many conversations in this. There's not very much action. There's lots and lots of talking, people talking to each other, and all of the conversations seem like they are drawn somewhere from one letter or another from Paul, or something that Peter said somewhere, or people reminding each other of a parable that they've heard that Jesus told. And so there's lots of this stuff which is a kind of pastiche of scripture, but it's trying to put it in context, and it's not too cheesy, most of it. And as I said, there were moments when the story kind of really took off, but it doesn't really succeed on the level of a book that you would read purely for entertainment purposes. So why would you read this book? I can think of two reasons why you might be interested in reading the book. One is the one that Paula Gooder is talking about. And she makes her argument in her introduction, which comes after the story. She talks about why she's written the book and what she intends for it. And basically, it's for people who are trying to get to grips with scripture, in particular, the epistles from the New Testament. And she talks about how it's a useful exercise trying to imagine yourself into the world. And I completely agree with her. It's really easy to think of the letters wrongly and to read them wrongly because you don't imagine their context, especially the letters, because they kind of have direct address. The stories, like narrative parts of the Bible where there are things happening, it's obvious that isn't something that's addressed to us, that we have to interpret it to figure out how it applies to us in any kind of meaningful way. But the letters, the mistake that's really easy to make is to kind of think that it's written to you when in fact it's not written to you. It may in some sense have been written for us, but it was not written to us. It was written to a particular people in a particular place who have particular things going on, and unless you kind of get to grips with that and factor that context in, it's easy to make mistakes in applying what's there. And that's important because a large part of the New Testament is epistles, and a lot of Christian theology is based off these epistles. So this work that Paula has done in the book of imagining in great detail the specifics of a context, to try and kind of draw out how things in the letters applied to those first recipients, how they may have been intended by the author to be read, is really useful in thinking about how those words may apply to other people at other times. If you don't go through that first step, you can make lots of mistakes. Now, she doesn't say that that she's right in everything that she's kind of imagined. In fact, she says in her introduction that she would be perfectly happy for you to throw out all of the particulars of what she's imagined, as long as you then go and do some work yourself in imagining something different. She just thinks that it's a really useful exercise in terms of helping us to read the Bible meaningfully, to imagine the context. And I agree with her. And that's the first kind of reason why I could think of that you might be interested in this book, that it might be a useful tool to help somebody who was already interested in reading the New Testament, to kind of help you flesh out your understanding of the New Testament. The second reason why I could imagine that you might be interested in picking this book up is somebody who doesn't have any background in Christianity, but is interested in getting to grips with some of the central theological ideas of Christianity. It's written as, a story, and so, a spoonful of sugar kind of thinking. It'd be a lot easier to get through this book by Paula Goddard about things that were going on in this church in first century Rome, with all the kind of comings and goings and, daily dramas and that sort of stuff. A lot easier to get through reading that than it would be, say, reading through, Calvin's Institutes. Not that this book is entirely as comprehensive as Calvin's Institutes. However, it does actually cover quite a lot of the central ideas of Christian thinking, Christian theology. So if you are in the position as somebody who really has very, very little background on how Christians view the world and want a kind of accessible way in, it's very possible that this could be a good starting point because it's got a story and it was quite an easy read. So that's what I have to say about Phoebe by Paula Goddard. If you've got any specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If anybody's read this and wants to talk to me about it, I'd love to talk to you. I hope you're all well. I'll talk to you later. Bye.